she looked down at her hands and was surprised to see that she'd put on one of the rabbit's little white gloves while she was talking. How can I have done that? She thought. I must be growing small again. She got up and went to the table to measure herself by it, and found that, as nearly as she could guess, she was now about 2 feet high, and was going on shrinking rapidly. She soon found out that the cause of this was the fan she was holding, and she dropped it hastily, just in time to save herself from shrinking away altogether. "Whew, that was a narrow escape," said Alice. "And now for the garden." And she ran with all speed back to the little door. But alas, the little door was shut again, and the little golden key was lying on the glass table as before. "And things are worse than ever," thought the poor child, "for I never was so small as this before, never." As she said these words, her foot slipped, and in another moment, splash, she was up to her chin in salt water. She soon made out that she was in the pool of tears which she'd wept when she was 9 feet high. "I wish I hadn't cried so much," said Alice. She swam about, trying to find a way out. "I shall be punished for it now, I suppose, by being drowned in my own tears. That will be a queer thing, to be sure. However, everything is queer today." Just then she heard something splashing about in the pool a little way off, and she swam nearer to make out what it was. At first she thought it must be a walrus or a hippopotamus. Then she remembered how small she was now, and she soon made out it was only a mouse that had slipped in like herself. So she began. "Oh, Mouse, do you know the way out of this pool? I'm very tired of swimming about here, oh Mouse." Alice thought this must be the right way of speaking to a mouse. She'd never done such a thing before, but she remembered having seen in her brother's Latin grammar, "A mouse, of a mouse, to a mouse, oh mouse." The mouse looked at her rather inquisitively, and seemed to her to wink with one of its little eyes, but it said nothing. "Perhaps it doesn't understand English," thought Alice. "I dare say it's a French mouse, come over with William the Conqueror." So she began again. "Où est ma chatte?" which was the first sentence in her French lesson book. The mouse gave a sudden leap out of the water and seemed to quiver all over with fright. "Oh, I beg your pardon," cried Alice hastily, afraid she'd hurt the poor animal's feelings. "I quite forgot you didn't like cats." Not like cats," cried the mouse. "Would you like cats if you were me?" "Well, perhaps not," said Alice. "Don't be angry about it. And yet, I wish I could show you our cat Dinah. I think you'd take a fancy to cats if you could only see her. And she sits purring so nicely by the fire, licking her paws and washing her face. And she's such a capital one for catching mice." "Oh, I beg your pardon," cried Alice again, for the mouse was swimming away from her as hard as it could go. So she called softly after, "Mouse dear, do come back again, and we won't talk about cats if you don't like them." When the mouse heard this, it turned round and swam slowly back to her. Its face was quite pale, with passion, Alice thought, and it said in a low, trembling voice, "Let us skip to the shore, and then I'll tell you my history, and you'll understand why it is I hate cats and dogs." It was high time to go, for the pool was getting quite crowded with the birds and animals that had fallen into it. There were a duck and a dodo, a lorry and an eaglet, and several other curious creatures. Alice led the way, and the whole party swam to the shore. They were indeed a queer-looking party that assembled on the bank. The birds with draggled feathers, the animals with their fur clinging close to them, and all dripping wet, cross and uncomfortable. The first question was, of course, how to get dry again. At last the mouse, who seemed to be a person of authority among them, called out, "Sit down, all of you." They all sat down at once in a large ring with the mouse in the middle. "What I was going to say," said the dodo in an offended tone, was that the best thing to get us dry would be a caucus race. What is a caucus race? Said Alice. Why, said the Dodo, the best way to explain it is to do it. First it marked out a race course in a sort of circle. The exact shape doesn't matter, it said. And then all the party were placed along the course here and there. There was no 1, 2, 3 and away. They began running when they liked and left off when they liked, so it was not easy to know when the race was over. However, when they'd been running half an hour or so and were quite dry again, the Dodo suddenly called out, "The race is over!" And they all crowded round it, panting and asking, But who has won? This question the Dodo could not answer without a great deal of thought. At last it said, "Everybody has won, and all must have prizes." "But who is to give the prizes?" quite a chorus of voices asked. "Why, she, of course," said the Dodo, pointing to Alice with one finger. And the whole party at once crowded round her, calling out in a confused way, "Prizes, prizes!" Alice had no idea what to do, and in despair she put her hands in her pockets and pulled out a box of comfits and handed them round as prizes. There was exactly one apiece all round. "But she must have a prize herself, you know," said the Mouse. "Of course," the Dodo replied very gravely. "What else have you got in your pockets?" he went on, turning to Alice. "Only a thimble," said Alice sadly. "Hand it over here," said the Dodo. Then they all crowded round her once more while the Dodo solemnly presented the thimble, saying, "We beg your acceptance of this elegant thimble." And when it had finished this short speech, they all cheered. Alice thought the whole thing very absurd. However, when it was over at last, they sat down again in a ring. "I wish I had our Dinah here," said Alice aloud, addressing nobody in particular. "Dinah's our cat. Oh, I wish you could see her after the birds." This speech caused a remarkable sensation among the party. Some of the birds hurried off at once. One old magpie began wrapping itself up very carefully, remarking, "But I really must be getting home. The night air doesn't suit my throat." And a canary called out in a trembling voice to its children, "Come away, my dears. High time we were all in bed." On various pretexts they all moved off, and Alice was soon left alone. She felt very lonely and low-spirited. In a while, however, she again heard a little pattering of footsteps in the distance, and looked up eagerly. It was the White Rabbit. "Oh, the Duchess, the Duchess! Oh, my dear paws! Oh, my fur and whiskers! She'll get me executed as sure as ferrets are ferrets! Oh, where can I have dropped them, I wonder?" Alice guessed in a moment that he was looking for the fan and the pair of white kid gloves, and she very good-naturedly began hunting about for them. Very soon the rabbit noticed Alice. "Why, Mary Ann, what are you doing out here? Oh, run home this minute and fetch me a pair of gloves and a fan. Oh, quick now!" And Alice was so much frightened, she ran off at once in the direction it had pointed to, without trying to explain the mistake it had made. "He took me for his housemaid," she said to herself as she ran, "but I'd better take him his fan and gloves, that is, if I can find them." As she said this, she came upon a neat little house, on the door of which was a bright brass plate with the name W. Rabbit engraved upon it. She went in without knocking and hurried upstairs, in great fear lest she should meet the real Mary Ann. "How queer it seems," Alice said to herself, "to be going messages for a rabbit." By this time she'd found her way into a tidy little room, with a table in the window, and on it, as she'd hoped, a fan and 2 or 3 pairs of tiny white kid gloves. She took up the fan and a pair of the gloves, and was just going to leave the room when her eye fell upon a little bottle that stood near the looking-glass. "I know something interesting is sure to happen," she said to herself, "whenever I eat or drink anything, so I'll just see what this bottle does. I do hope it'll make me grow large again, for really, I'm quite tired of being such a tiny little thing." It did so indeed, and much sooner than she'd expected. Before she'd drunk half the bottle, she found her head pressing against the ceiling and had to stoop to save her neck from being broken. Still she went on growing, and as a last resort, she put one arm out of the window and one foot up the chimney. Luckily for Alice, the little magic bottle had now had its full effect, and she grew no larger. After a few minutes, she heard a voice outside. "Mary Ann? Mary Ann?" said the voice. Fetch me my gloves this minute." Then came a little pattering of feet on the stairs. Presently the rabbit came up to the door and tried to open it. But as the door opened inwards, and Alice's elbow was pressed hard against it, that attempt proved a failure. Alice heard it say to itself, "Then I'll go round and get in at the window." "That you won't," thought Alice, and after waiting till she fancied she heard the rabbit just under the window, she suddenly spread out her hand and made a snatch in the air. She did not get hold of anything, but she heard a little shriek and a fall and a crash of broken glass, from which she concluded it was just possible it had fallen into a cucumber frame or something of the sort. Next came an angry voice, the rabbit's. "Pet, Pet, where are you?" And then a voice she'd never heard before. "Sure, then I'm here, digging for apples, your honour." "Digging for apples, indeed," said the rabbit angrily. "Here, come and help me out of this." Ooh. Sounds of more broken glass. There was a long silence after this, and Alice could only hear whispers now and then, such as, "Oh, sure, and I don't like it, your honour, at all. Do as I tell you, you coward." "Here, Bill, the master says you've to go down the chimney." "Oh, so Bill's got to come down the chimney, has he?" said Alice to herself. "I wouldn't be in Bill's place for a good deal. This fireplace is narrow, to be sure, but I think I can kick a little." She drew her foot as far down the chimney as she could, and waited till she heard a little animal, she couldn't guess of what sort it was, scratching and scrambling about in the chimney close about her. Then, saying to herself, "This is Bill," she gave one sharp kick and waited to see what would happen next. The first thing she heard was a general chorus of, "There goes Bill," and the rabbit's voice alone, "We must burn the house down." And Alice called out as loud as she could, "If you do, I'll set Dinah at you." There was dead silence instantly. After a minute or two they began moving about again, and Alice heard the rabbit say, "A barrowful will do, to begin with." A barrowful of what? thought Alice. The next moment a shower of little pebbles came rattling in at the window, and some of them hit her in the face. Alice noticed with some surprise that the pebbles were all turning into little cakes, and a bright idea came into her head. She swallowed one of the cakes, and was delighted to find she began shrinking directly. As soon as she was small enough to get through the door,